and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about the movie BlackBerry, which is directed by Matt Johnson and was released in 2023. And I'm comparing it with the book Losing the Signal, the untold story behind the extraordinary rise and the spectacular fall of BlackBerry. And it was written by Jackie McNish and Sean Silkoff, released in 2015. And as you can tell by the full title of the book, this is about the rise and fall of the BlackBerry phone. And Blackberries were like the big thing before iPhone and Androids started. And so I feel like people who are like at least 30 will remember Blackberries. People younger than that, I don't know. But yeah, we all know that this isn't going to be like some feel-good victory story because nobody uses Blackberries anymore, right? So clearly it didn't pan out for them the way they thought it would in the long term. So it's not going to be like that movie Air, which I saw and I really liked and I would recommend. That movie's about the Air Jordan. And we all know that was a huge success. So at the end of that movie, you're just like, yeah, feel good success story. That's not the case with BlackBerry because their company failed essentially. So anyway, but onto the book review. So this book, it was very well researched and it was very well written. However, I didn't give it like a great rating, but honestly, that is just personal preference really, because this has a lot of corporate and tech talk. And those are two things that I just sometimes have a hard time understanding. I have never worked at a corporate job or anything like that. So I don't know, I have a hard time understanding some of the corporate side of things, and then technology as well. That's never been my thing. And I went back and forth between reading it and listening to it, and I think I probably should have just read a lot of it instead because that would have helped my consumption of the information. But I was trying to read this pretty quickly because I started it late and I wanted to get this episode out as soon as possible. So I also listened to it as well, and I don't know if that necessarily helped with my understanding of it. But honestly, even times when I was reading it, I was having a hard time being like, wait, what's happening? Again, it's not that it was poorly written. It was just me, and I sometimes have a hard time comprehending certain corporate business type things. I had the same problem with House of Gucci. Like whenever they were getting into the personal people and the family drama, I loved it. But then they got into the business side of things and I would be like, wait, what's going on? Why is this happening? So personal preference at the end of the day. But I'm not going to hate on this book because like I said, I am glad I read it. It was well written, well researched, and it is one I would recommend if this is more of your style, And on Goodreads, some of the people who gave it like 5 stars are people who worked for BlackBerry for one, or people who are more familiar with this world. I think they would enjoy it more than I did. And then on to the movie review. So I did see this movie in theaters, and by the time this episode comes out, I know where I live, like theaters are kicking it out after 1 week. So by today, it's going to be in far fewer theaters. But if it is still playing where you live by chance, you should definitely go see it. I really enjoyed this movie. It was very riveting and engaging, and the performances were all amazing. We have the 2 leads. Glenn Howerton as Jim Balsillie, and then Jay Baruchel as Mike Lazaridis, and both of them were amazing. But also everybody else too, right? Like Matt Johnson plays the role of Doug, and just everybody was incredible. My biggest complaint really is just like the camera work that was done. Like we have a lot of like movie shaky cameras, and we also get like the spy shots, right? Where like someone is having a meeting in an office, and rather than the camera like being in the office, we're seeing it from like the office window, like the person is standing outside the meeting. And I get, Matt Johnson was going, for the vibe he wanted by doing it that way, but I personally just didn't like it, and I was wishing it was just filmed in a more regular movie way, personally. The hair and makeup also is not very well done. It wasn't a distraction, but it was something that I would notice from time to time. But despite the camera work and despite the hair and makeup, yeah, this movie was amazing. I absolutely loved it. I'm already looking forward to watching it a second time, and I would highly recommend it. And it's also a good mix of like a lot of tense drama scenes, but then it has a lot of comedy as well. And then it just also, has the heart and the integrity behind it. And also like lawyers prevented them from doing anything that was like too far from the truth. Like obviously, we'll get into some of the differences and some of the inaccuracies, but there's nothing in the movie that's just like so out of left field and is just like so wrong, So for the most part, it is fairly close to the real story. But from here on out, I'm going to get into the differences between the movie and the true story, and so there will be spoilers for both. And spoiler alert, Apple changed everything. But starting with just Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie and just their meeting and them as people. So in the movie, Mike Lazaridis and his partner Doug Freegan from the company Research in Motion, which is called RIM, they approached Jim Balsillie, which his name in the audiobook, they pronounced his name Balsillie, but then in the movie he says Balsillie. So Balsillie Balsillie. Balsillie is kind of, interchangeable, I guess. I'm not sure. Anyway, they approach Balsillie with this idea for Pocket Link, this phone that also has email, and they want Balsillie to invest in it. However, Jim is just not really paying attention because in the movie he's distracted because he has this meeting coming up for the company he works for, and there's this merger going on, and so that's just what he's focused on, and so he just basically tells them whatever, get out of here. And when they leave, he goes into his meeting and then he pulls this stunt that he wasn't supposed to have done in the meeting, and we end up realizing that this gets him fired. And so he then approaches Rim and he's like, okay, I'll invest in your company, but I want to be CEO. And Mike and Doug are just like, no, that's not happening. And they end the meeting. And after this, Doug calls Jim a shark, and he's telling Mike, we shouldn't get involved with him. He's, shady. He's a shark. However, Mike, can see the benefit of having him on their team, and he thinks they need him. And so they call him up and make him a new offer, which will still include him being co-CEO, and Jim agrees. In real life, Balsillie was working for this other company, and this company was being taken over by another company. And he was good friends with the guy who ran the original company. And the two of them were together when the guy was on speakerphone with this new company that was coming in. And the new company told him, they didn't know Jim was in the room, and they told him, we don't want Balsillie, get rid of him before we start merging the companies. And they just thought he was too abrasive and difficult to work with. And so the boss is awkward because Jim is right here hearing this. But since he likes him, he's like, hey, you'll get a severance package. And with this severance package, you should reach out to this company, Research in Motion, because they approached the boss for money, but he wasn't interested at the time, but he could see their promise. So he recommended them to Jim. And in the book, in real life, they do have a back and forth as far as the deal they want to have going on. But ultimately, when Balsillie is interested and that he likes the deal, Mike is okay, first I want you to meet my wife because she's a good judge of character. So I want you guys to meet, and then we can go from there. And so they go on a double date with each of their wives. And after the meeting, after the date, Mike's wife is he's a shark, right? And he's yeah, I know that. And she's okay, well, as long as you're aware, then yeah, I think you should partner with him. So in real life, it was his wife that called him a shark, not Doug. And as the movie shows, Rim was in massive debt, and so he invests $120,000, but that's just a drop in the bucket because of how much debt they have. But once he is working with them, he just really pushes them to get things done. And in the movie especially, Rim is just showed as this group of guys who just they clearly know what they're doing, but they also just slack off so much, and they're always goofing around. And it's cool, they have a fun work environment, but when Jim shows up, he's kind of he whips them into shape and has them hurry and get things done. And so we see in the book and movie how Mike and Jim were so vital with BlackBerry, right? Because without Jim, they would not have been able to sell these phones and market these phones the way they did, and they would not have taken off the way they did. But obviously you needed Mike as well, because without Mike, there wouldn't be the phone to begin with. But as we'll get into, there's this other guy who sues BlackBerry later on, and he was very similar to Mike. He had the brains to create this cool idea, but he didn't have a Jim, and so it never took off. And so he just, that guy ended up becoming nothing, essentially, whereas Mike had BlackBerry thanks to his partnership with Jim. In the first scene in the movie where they pitch the future BlackBerry, it's not called a BlackBerry yet, but they pitch it to Verizon, a company that later becomes Verizon. And yeah, it's a great scene. We see Jim's marketing skills, but we also see Mike and how knowledgeable he is and how smart he is. And it's also just a very tense scene too, because they leave the prototype in the taxi. And so they're freaking out, and then the meeting is happening and Mike has left, but then he shows up and he shows that he got the prototype out of the taxi. And that did happen in real life too, where they left a prototype in a taxi, but eventually they were able to retrieve it. So yeah, I just thought that was a great scene. And all of the scenes that involved them talking to a board or a business meeting or pitching an idea, all of them were just so well done. And then I did want to talk about Jim Balsillie, because in the movie, he is shown as just very abrasive and aggressive, and he's constantly yelling, right? And he gets things done, but he just seems just a very difficult person in some ways and very aggressive. What they don't show is that he could also be very likable, and that's an important trait to have when you're a salesman, right? Is to be likable. And we do see that to some extent. We see his salesman abilities. However, Balsillie himself saw this movie and he said, I'm aggressive, I'm competitive, I'm ambitious, I own that. But when I first saw the movie, I was confused for about 5 minutes. And then I thought, thought, okay, we're being roasted here. They're taking an element of truth, who I am, and they're playing with it. So of course, he is exaggerated to some extent for the movie. But there was a story in the book how like they were in a pitch meeting and Balsillie was asked a question and then he kind of pauses and he doesn't answer. And so another guy from RIM, he kind of steps in and he answers the question. And after this other guy talks, Balsillie looks at him and the book reads, "Eric," he said, growing cold with fury, "don't you ever, and Eric's stomach twisted with each ever, interrupt me in a meeting again." After an awkward silence, Balsillie continued with the presentation. So it isn't like they totally fabricated Balsillie's harsh personality, because that definitely was how he was. They just, exaggerated it just a tad bit, which is to be expected. But speaking of fabricating characters, one person who is just like basically a total fabrication is Doug Fragan, because he was a real person and he had been childhood friends with Mike Lazaridis, but just everything about his character is like totally fictionalized. And he's just a much bigger character in the movie. Like he's talked about in the book, but not nearly as much as we see him in the movie. And in the movie, he is played by the director, Matt Johnson. But he has this distinct style of always wearing tank tops or like movie shirts and wearing a sweatband. And whenever he goes to meetings, he always has this sweatband on and you're just like, man, like take the sweatband off. But that's not based on reality. That's just what Matt Johnson decided to do with this character. But we also see how, like I said, they're lifelong friends, and Mike is just very meek and shy and soft-spoken. And so Doug will often step up for him and like speak on Mike's behalf. And specifically with Balsillie, right? Because Balsillie is so aggressive. And so Doug, stands up for Mike and tries to speak for him, which we do see at a later point where Mike is annoyed at that. And he's like, hey, let me say what I feel, like you don't know everything I feel and let me talk for myself. But even though Doug is obviously a smart guy in the movie, he's also just kind of a goof, as Balsillie says, and he seems to slack off a lot. And, he values the fun work environment. But as they show in the movie, if you're going to work on the greatest phone in the world, it takes a lot of hard work, right? And sometimes you got to stop slacking off and stop having fun and just get to work. But yeah, none of this was in the book or in real life. And there was also no talk of movie nights at RIM either. But also, while talking about fictionalized people, I don't remember Purdy ever being mentioned in the book. And I even searched, because I read this on Kindle. So I searched the name Purdy because I was like, did I just miss something? But no, his name is not in the book at all. So if there was a person in real life who was his equivalent, then they had a different name. But yeah, I don't remember reading about a character like that. But he is a guy in the movie. Balsillie hires him to get the engineers in line. And so he gets them to, stop slacking off so much. And Balsillie hires him, but Mike, because he's so soft-spoken, he will use Purdy and be like, hey, go tell him to stop movie night and work on this instead, But yeah, he was a great character, great actor. Michael Ironsides, I believe is his name. But yeah, I don't remember ever reading about a character like him in the book. But I do remember reading how some of the original RIM employees talked about how much RIM changed. But that's kind of to be expected, right? When you go from being just this rink-a-dink thing to having a company that's creating the biggest phone in the world, of course things are going to change and the environment will change and you become more professional, right? And new people get hired and it gets to the point where you don't even recognize anybody. So I understand how that would be hard, but at the same time, it's not very surprising that would happen, right? But to talk about the BlackBerry, so in real life and in the movie, the original name they had been using for the future BlackBerry was Pocket Link. And in the book we read, other choices include Easy Mail and Mega Mail too. It was clear now to marketing that these names didn't work. Mega and Mail were anxiety triggers. What RIM needed was a name that lowered workers' blood pressure. And so in the book, they are brainstorming different words that are just fun and stress-free. And so they think of summertime and strawberries and blackberries. And then also market research showed that people like that double B sound, it just sounds good, but people also associate it with efficiency. And so BlackBerry just ended up being the best name. And we don't get any of that in the movie. We just see them when they're pitching the phone at the very, first meeting. It kind of is implied that they go with BlackBerry because Mike has a stain on his shirt from berries he'd been eating. So it makes it seem like, oh, he had a stain and then they called it BlackBerry. But I thought it was interesting in the book, how they went about brainstorming for this name. But yeah, we don't see that in the movie. But once the BlackBerry takes off, it eventually makes it onto Oprah's favorite things list, which was a huge moment. And it is referenced in multiple multiple TV shows, and in general, it just like takes over the world. And something we see in the book is that even when iPhone comes out, the BlackBerry is still really popular in other countries where people couldn't afford the iPhone. So early on, they were still doing well to some extent. Not in America, but at least in other countries, they were still doing well. But obviously, eventually that came to an end as well. And yeah, I remember BlackBerries. My brother had one. I never did. When it came out, I was like in middle school and high school, and I couldn't even afford like a normal cell phone. So yeah, I never had one, but my brother did. So I do remember that. And yeah, this book just made me realize like the huge impact BlackBerries had on our society and on the world, like I said. So yeah, at the time I wasn't quite aware of it. And so I also wasn't watching a lot of like new stuff either. And so yeah, reading this book, I was just like, man, how did I not know what a big deal this was? But yeah, I was just a teenager doing my own thing at the time, not paying attention to what technology was out there because I couldn't afford it anyway. But to talk about Palm Pilot, I do remember Palm Pilots as well, and I did have like this cheap knockoff one. But they were the big thing like before BlackBerries. And in the movie and in real life, the guy at Palm Pilot, he approaches Mike and Jim, and he says he wants to like merge with BlackBerry and create like a BlackBerry Palm Pilot combo. And he says that if they don't agree to this partnership, then he can just buy them out because their stock is low enough and he can afford it, and he'll just do a hostile takeover and he'll be in charge of BlackBerry and he can do whatever he wants. And so Jim says yes, just leading him along, and he just strings him along in real life, he strings him along for like quite some time. But they are able to, increase their sale of the phones and get the stock to increase so much that it gets to the point where the Palm Pilot guy can no longer afford to buy them out. And that is how they avoid that whole thing. But Verizon, they could only have so many phones on their network. And so in order to sell more and keep them working, which BlackBerries did have a number of like breakdowns throughout the years where like everybody with a black phone, like they were experiencing glitches and not getting their messages. But BlackBerry, they hire new engineers in order to figure out how to get more phones on these towers. And then we get the scene in the movie where Jim goes to Verizon, and when he shows up, Verizon is upset and they're wanting to cancel the contract. But Jim flips it on him and he's like, we fixed the problem and we quadrupled the amount of phones that can be on Verizon now because we have engineers and they hacked into your towers and they fixed it. So you're welcome. And the stock goes up 400%. And so yeah, obviously the Palm Pilot guy can't buy it anymore. And yeah, in the book, the Palm Pilot guy, which I forget his real name, he's played by Cary Elwes in the movie though. But he was just really annoying and constantly one-upping them. And we see in the movie, Mike is like messaging Jim. And that is something that's talked about where like Jim and Mike would like be BlackBerry messaging each other during the meetings what they would have with this guy. But yeah, this guy was always one-upping them. And so then Mike and Jim turned it into a game where they would brag about something completely false just to see what this guy would end up saying. And at one point, Jim says that he won a gold medal for hockey in the Olympics. Yeah, the Palm Pilot guy like one-ups him somehow with his medals that he has. And so he was just a ridiculous person, essentially. But we have to, of course, talk about the iPhone. So when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone in 2007, that changed everything. And I wish I remembered that moment in history more clearly. But again, I was in high school and I do remember my dad wanted an iPhone because he loved Apple products. But aside from that, like I do not remember realizing how revolutionary the iPhone was. And so in the movie as well as the book, like when they talk about that moment when he, shows it and he meets with the AT&T guy, like it's just such a monumentous moment. And in hindsight, right, like in 2007, some people realized what a big change this would be. But obviously in hindsight, we realize it even more so, the impact that had on the world. And so looking back now and seeing that footage, you're just like, wow, like it changed everything. Which, by the way, the BlackBerry, though, that was the start of people just like being hooked on their phones because they could be emailing each other or on like BBM. And so that was the start of people just like staring down, looking at things, right? And so they call them crackberries, that is mentioned in the movie. And that was also like a real thing that people would call it because it was like crack because you were so addicted to it. But anyway, the announcement of the iPhone was obviously huge news for people in the phone industry. And prior to the announcement, BlackBerry had been working on this upcoming phone called like BlackBerry Bold that had a trackpad. And that was like the big thing they were working on was this trackpad in the BlackBerry. And in the movie, Jim is busy trying to buy a hockey team. And so he's not even there for like this meeting that goes on. But Mike takes Doug and he goes to meet with Verizon and he pitches this new BlackBerry with a trackpad. And the Verizon guy, he's like, I'm kind of disappointed. I thought you were going to have something saying, along the lines of the iPhone, like that's what we want now. We want the all glass front. We don't want a keypad anymore. And in the movie, Mike kind of has a breakdown of sorts where he is just like very upset, about the iPhone and the change that it is happening. And he's like, people love the keypad. That's what they like about the BlackBerry. And I don't know who iPhone thinks they are, getting rid of the keypad. And he keeps trying to push, like, we have this trackpad now, but we just, he can see that the trackpad is nothing, right? And that's not enough. And so then he pivots and he lies and he's like, you know what? The reason Jim isn't here is because he's back in Waterloo working on a new BlackBerry, which will have the full glass screen and it'll have a keypad that pops up like the iPhone. And so then that appeases Verizon. Whereas in the movie, so Mike, I don't remember if Jim was there, but Mike goes to Verizon and he's pitching the BlackBerry Bold. And partway through the meeting, he can see that he's losing them and they're not excited about this. And so he pivots early and he shows them the BlackBerry Storm, which they already had a prototype for. And it had the all glass front like the iPhone. And so he switches and he focuses on the Storm instead. And the team, Verizon is like, yes, like this is what we want. And they're very excited about it. So in real life, he already had been working on a prototype of that, whereas in the movie, he lies about it, and then they have to like hurry and actually get it going. But I want to circle back around to talk about Jim Balsillie and the NHL because in the movie, Jim is like juggling multiple things. He's trying to buy an NHL team. Meanwhile, we have the iPhone stuff going on. Meanwhile, we have the SECs trying to call them, which we'll get into. And he will put BlackBerry on the back burner and he's like prioritizing his purchase of the hockey team. So it's pretty frustrating in this part of the movie where he's just like so obsessed with the hockey. And it's like, man, like Mike's trying to call you, like, come on. And while in real life, Jim did try to buy an American hockey team and he wanted to move it to Canada because BlackBerry is located in Waterloo. So that really was a thing and he did meet with them. However, it wasn't like, obviously things were happening at BlackBerry at the same time, but it wasn't like literally like the same day kind of a thing. Like the movie switches the timelines around to make it seem like everything is happening right now, which is a good tactic, right? Because it makes it very exciting and tense. But it is an exaggeration and it wasn't quite as dramatic like that in real life. But in both, the NHL votes against him and he is not able to buy a hockey team. And in the movie, they say that they voted against him because he brags about it to the Palm Pilot guy that he's buying a hockey team and moving them to Canada. But in real life, they just like didn't like him and they blamed it on something else. But ultimately at the end of the day, like they just didn't like him and they didn't want to work with him and they didn't want him buying a team. And so they vote him out. And that's a great scene in the movie. Again, that's like, Glenn Howerton has a number of outbursts throughout this movie, but his outburst in front of the NHL board was definitely like one of the more heightened ones. And if you're a fan of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, you know that Dennis, Glenn Howerton plays Dennis in It's Always Sunny. And he has a number of like these rage moments, which, you just gotta love it, right? Like he's so great at doing those scenes. And so he was great in this role of Balsillie and these moments where he's just, blowing his top. It was great and it was what I was hoping I would get when I went into this movie, But to move on to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So when they were in that hiring frenzy, in the movie, it was specifically when they were trying to get more BlackBerries to be on the Verizon towers. Whereas in real life, I think it was just throughout the growth of BlackBerry. They were just hiring so many people because the company was growing like crazy. And so they were just hiring a ton of people constantly and there was always someone new. And so during this time, they would give the future employees stock options and they were backdating the stock options so that they would be worth more. And in the movie, he does this because he's trying to get these high-ranking engineers like at Google and places. And so he's offering them like $10 million by backdating a stock option. And in the movie, they're clearly like, is this legal? And so it seems like they're very well aware that this is shady and not legal, but they do it anyway. However, Mike knows nothing about it and he is not told about it. Whereas in real life, Mike did know to some degree. Like it kind of went over his head though, because he was just focusing on the engineering aspect. And so he did feel kind of like, it wasn't his fault. And in the movie, he cuts a deal with the SEC and he kind of tricks Jim into showing up. And once Jim is there, he calls the SEC and turns Jim in. And we see that he had done a deal with them where if he turned Jim in, he would kind of like get off scot-free, essentially, it seems like. Whereas that wasn't the case in real life because they both got in trouble. However, Mike did cut a deal behind Jim's back, and so Mike got in less in trouble, but they both were in trouble at the end of the day. And the movie makes it seem like it is because of this stock fraud thing that is why Jim steps down as being CEO. But unless I'm remembering wrong, like both of them resigned as CEOs at the same time in 2012. And so the movie, it says that Mike resigns in 2012, but it like implies that Jim was forced to resign after the lawsuit thing with the stocks. But so that wasn't quite how it happened in real life. Oh, but also I did want to say in the movie, the reason why Jim isn't there when the SEC shows up is because one, he's doing his NHL stuff, but then he also is going to talk to the AT&T guy. And when he's talking to the AT&T guy, he realizes like the industry is changing because it is no longer about selling minutes. It is now about selling data. And so just again, the change in the phone industry with the iPhone, they switch because minutes used to be the big thing, right? And now you buy a plan based on the data. But something that the movie doesn't show is that before the whole stuff with the SEC happened, BlackBerry was being sued. They had a patent lawsuit against them from this guy. I forgot to write his name down, but the company was like NTP Incorporated. But it was basically like this skeleton corporation that just had patents under their name, because this is the guy who was similar to Lazaridis, where he was really smart and he came up with this idea to do email messaging on a phone, but he didn't have the gym in his life, and so it never took off. But he kept the patent, and so he had this patent under this other company's name. And he had originally sued BlackBerry in 2001, which led to RIM suffering a humiliating court defeat in 2002, multiple failed appeals, and settlement talks foundered. Now a Virginian judge was threatening to take the company to the brink by enforcing an injunction to bar BlackBerry service in the US. And so in 2006 is when this whole thing finally came to an end, and BlackBerry RIM had to pay $612 million to this guy. And so the financial cost was obviously a huge blow, but an even bigger blow is just the hit that they took to their confidence and their partnership, and also just like the constant stress they were under. And Balsillie, and he talks about struggling with depression, and he reaches out to like this self-help guru to help him like figure out how to manage this, because he was just so overwhelmed and feeling depressed. And Mike, obviously, he was a religious person, so he would turn to religion as a way to help him deal with it. But yeah, the movie does not show any of that patent lawsuit that happened. But the movie ends with Mike, he needs to hurry and get these Storm phones made, and the only way to do it as quickly as they need is to have them be made in China. And he has been resisting this because he takes pride in creating a product that he doesn't cut corners with, right? And early in the movie, there's this like telecom machine or whatever, intercom machine, and it has this buzzing white noise sound, and it's because it was poorly made. And he's like, I don't want to contribute to the crappy white noise machines, I want to create something that I can be proud of. And so he's resisted having them be made in China, but he gets to the point where he's like, okay, we're doing it. We're moving it to China. And so when the shipments finally come in, he opens the phone up and he turns it on, and it has that white noise whir. And so we see him going through phone by phone, fixing it so that it doesn't make that buzzing sound anymore. And then we see Balsillie, and he's out fishing, and it says how he avoided jail time with the stock fraud. And basically, the movie kind of implies Jim Balsillie is a sleazebag, and he got away with everything, and he sucks, and he just was totally unscathed in the process. But it's true to some extent, because he and Mike didn't have to do any jail time. They had to pay a ton of money. And yeah, ultimately they retired from BlackBerry incredibly rich. But that's not to say that he was totally unaffected and unscathed by everything that BlackBerry went through, And this was his company just as much as Mike's, right? They were both so invested, and they loved BlackBerry and RIM and what it was achieving. And so to let go of it was huge, right? And when Mike resigns, with him in particular, there was a part in the book where it said how when he worked for RIM, when he was the CEO, he would just kind of walk around the office and check out the engineers and see what they were working on. And once he resigns, he still stays on, and he tries to do that, walk around the office. But one of the new guys in charge is like, hey, you got to stop doing that. And to be told that, in the company you created, and he was just like, wow. And so eventually he just, left entirely. But yeah, they still are crazy rich, but still, just, it was more about the money in some ways, Sorry, what I mean to say is it was about more than just the money for them, because it was something that they had created and something that they were proud of, and then they just totally lost it, And the story made me realize how amazing it is when a company can adapt and change as the world changes. So often some huge product comes along and it changes the world, but then when the world changes yet again, that product that had once been life-changing can adapt, and it fails, right? It just ends up falling by the wayside, and just, the BlackBerry, it's just something that we remember but is no longer existent. And BlackBerry used to take up 45% of the cell phone market, and now it takes up 0. And BlackBerry now, it's owned by some other guy, and he focuses on cyber security or something, so something totally different. But something I liked about the book too is it really showed Mike and Jim and how they were great business partners. They never hung out outside of work and they had very little in common outside of work. But when it came to work, like they were great and they were so in sync with each other. In the movie, we see how like when Jim crinkles a piece of paper, he's like, when I crinkle paper, it means you need to stop talking. And both of them had different things they would do like that during a meeting so that they could communicate. And so they were just so in sync and they were such great partners. But then as the years went on and different lawsuits happened and different stresses happened, just their partnership just kind of deteriorated. And how a successful business partnership is a lot like a marriage, right? And how they take so much work to maintain a good relationship with your business partner as well as a spouse. And so yeah, it was just sad and interesting to just see the progression of their business partnership. And we do see it in the movie, but I feel like it's shown even more in the book, I would say. But also just like two other changes I wanted to talk about. So I didn't get into BBM, which is BlackBerry messaging, which was huge because texting took up, because people were charged for texting and like the Verizon, the carriers got that money. Whereas BlackBerry messaging, that used data and that was money BlackBerry made. And so that was huge, but I didn't really get into that at all. But yeah, the movie shows that, and in the book we hear a lot about it. And then we also have the thing with the modems where RIM had this deal with US Robotics to sell them modems, but then US Robotics claimed they were defective and refused to pay them. And we see this in the movie, but we don't see is that in real life, Balsillie and his salesmen, they hear that these like Korean tech companies are interested in the modems, and so they end up selling the modems to these Korean companies, and it just helps RIM with their debt, right? Because they're able to resell the modems to someone else. But when it comes down to book versus movie, which one do I like better? So I'm glad I read the book. And I'm glad I went into the movie knowing the true story and the behind the scenes that the movie didn't get into. But at the end of the day, the movie wins. I definitely liked it better. And if I'm going to recommend one or the other, I would recommend the movie. Like I said, if you're into the tech stuff and the tech world and the business world too, I guess, like, yeah, you might enjoy the book more than I did. And you do learn so much. But yeah, ultimately, I like the movie much better. And it stays close enough to the true story. It doesn't embellish like crazy the way some, biopic docudramas do. And yeah, it was a great balance, like I said, of comedy, of drama, a lot of tense, suspenseful scenes. And yeah, there were a lot of moments that made me laugh too. So yeah, I love the movie. I would highly recommend it. And I guess that wraps it up for my BlackBerry episode. If you guys have any other questions on things I didn't get into in this episode, you can comment down below and I will talk about it. If you yourself had a BlackBerry, if you remember the huge change it was to get to us, moving from BlackBerries to smartphones, iPhones, comment down below and share your memories of that. Which I do remember. I had, just regular cell phones, but I remember when I got my first smartphone, it was an Android. I stayed up all night long just fiddling around with it, and I was just like, wow, this is insane. And I loved it. So I do remember I feel like getting your first smartphone was such a big experience, right? And I think anyone who went from having the old cell phones to a smartphone, I feel like we all remember that change, right? Because it was just so different than the previous cell phones we'd had. And like I said, I never had a BlackBerry, so I went from, whatever crappy cell phone to BlackBerries, or to an Android. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe, give my podcast a rating and review, share your thoughts down below in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye.